Hello, class. I want to welcome everyone and tell you that this is a short video that's going to maybe help you with all of your milestones. Um, you will have 3 milestones leading up to an argumentative essay in this course, and as you've probably noticed, um, the first, second, and third milestones come back to back. You have an annotated bibliography due in week 3. You have a primary source review to do the following week. And then in the 5th week, you have a book review to do. And of course, ideally, all of these are leading up to your ability to write a really good argumentative essay over some kind of topic that deals with the commodification of nature. So I would like to go over a few things about sources with you that should help you with your bibliography, because you're probably not surprised to learn that when you do the primary source analysis and you do the book review, these are going to be sources that come from your annotated bibliography. So it's really important when you do your annotated bibliography that you use the correct sources, and so I want to make some comments on those. So the annotated bibliography requires you to use 4 primary sources and at least 4 secondary sources. So I'm sure everyone knows that these are academic sources that we're looking for. We're not going to use any kind of tertiary sources, meaning like encyclopedias, regular websites, things like that. And so for an example, I'm going to kind of give you a primary source that would count. Then I'm also going to show you some of the secondary types of sources that you can use. And to try to give you some kind of focus, I do want to, let's just say, highlight John Muir for you. And it's not just because I'm a huge fan of John Muir's, but that has something to do with it as well. So let's say when you're trying to find your topic for commodification, you decide to do something on water resources. And you want to focus on the decision to flood Hetch Hetchy. The valley that was the sister valley, and I guess it still is, of Yosemite Valley in California. Now, John Muir is a big focal point when it comes to that particular topic because he fought so hard to prevent the flooding of Hetch Hetchy. And so I dare say you're not going to run across a source about the flooding of Hetch Hetchy that does not highlight John Muir a great deal. So if, for example, you wanted to focus on the commodification of water and focus on the decision to flood Hetch Hetchy, and understand it doesn't have to be water resources. You could focus on the commodification of animals. There have been some really great papers written, for example, about the commodification of buffalo, beavers. I've had actually a really great paper written recently about the whaling industry in colonial America. One of the things that you're going to read about too is that human beings were commodified, and human beings are part of nature. The writing about slavery is actually a topic that's written about a lot in this particular class. I've had students write about the commodification of natural resources. Of course, water is a natural resource, but I've had students focus on things like the commodification of soil in certain regions, the timber companies in certain regions, and certainly fossil fuels falls into that as well. So, but for the sake of focus, let's just say you've decided to do something on the flooding of Hetch Hetchy, and you're trying to find primary sources. Well, if you look in your merchant text, you're going to find that each chapter begins with selected primary sources, and then it has essays that follow the primary sources. So if you don't know what a primary source is, it's a source that dates back to the period that we're studying. Primary sources can be anything from speeches, diary entries, essays written at the time, and of course, even things like photographs are primary sources, because if you have a photograph, for example, that was taken of Hetch Hetchy Valley in like 1905, that's a source that catches at the time what it looked like. The important thing to understand is a primary source is not the source that you plan to use mostly. That's not what primary source means. So it's something that dates back to the time. Your book actually has a lot of really good primary sources for each topic. I'm not against you using the primary sources that are in the front of each chapter. So for example, talking about John Muir, if you look at chapter 11, for example, there's actually a really good entry from John Muir where he's advocating wilderness preservation. And for example, if you read that, you think, gosh, that's a really good source, I would like to use it, you are more than welcome to. I'm okay with that. One thing I will ask, a lot of these primary sources in the text are actually excerpts from a larger piece of work. So if you find one that you would like to use, if you Google it, most of these are, they're not copyrighted, so they're going to be in the public domain. You might actually find the lengthier source. And your book also has a number of acts. For example, if you look at the page in which John Muir's entry is in, and in my book it's 369, the following page has the National Parks Act of 1916. Government acts are also primary sources. And so you might look out if you're looking for a specific act you would like to use as a primary source. You might actually be able to find the entire thing in one of the chapters of your text. And that makes it easier. So for primary sources, though, looking back to things produced at the time, you will find some books are primary sources. For example, if you were to choose to do the commodification of humans, if you wanted to research slavery, you might find, for example, the narrative life of Frederick Douglass to be a very important source. It's a wonderful book. I often encourage students, anybody, to read it. It's only about 100 pages long, and you can find it online for free. But one thing that's important to understand about Frederick Douglass's autobiography is that that is a primary source. It is not something that you could use for a book review. And we'll get to that in just a minute. Also, just in case anybody's wondering, the book that you're using in this class also does not count for a book review. It is a compilation book made up of great primary sources and essays, but it is not considered to be a scholarly work focused on just one particular event. So up here I have from the Sierra Club, which was founded by John Muir, an example of a good primary source. It's a source that he wrote in 1890, and John Muir was known for writing about nature. And so you can find actually quite a few primary sources online. The Sierra Club I trust because it's his club and they actually preserve a lot of his writings. There's also a lot of good primary sources if you want to look up in the Library of Congress. You can find a lot of them. If you ever look up a source and you're not sure, you say, I don't really know if this counts, feel free to email me and send me the link to where you found it. And I'll be happy to review it for you. But like if we scroll through here, we have the beautiful writings of John Muir talking about the Yosemite Valley, along with some sketches from the time period. And this is a primary source from Muir from the time period that you would be studying if you chose to look into the reasons and the justification for taking Hetch Hetchy and damming it to help with the water supply. Or help meet the needs of the future water demands of San Francisco. Now, you do need 4 primary sources. Now, for the secondary sources, you're going to need to rely on scholarly sources. So I highly recommend that you use the Shapiro Library to find scholarly articles. And I have an example, like in the Shapiro Library, I searched for John Muir. And I was able to bring up this article written by Glenn MacDonald about Muir that was published in Boom, a Journal of California. This is a good example of a scholarly secondary source because if you're looking at journals, you're going to be reading articles that are written typically by experts in the field that are also peer-reviewed. That is a big deal because you should be able to verify that these are people who have some kind of experience. Many people will be affiliated with some kind of a college or institution, or you may have somebody who has earned a graduate degree and has went on to do research and writing in other ways. But the idea is when you're dealing with the scholarly sources, you want something that has been written by somebody who is an expert in the field. So depending on what you decide to research, you should be able to find enough in the Shapiro Library to get the 3 or 4 scholarly sources you'll need to get out of it. The Shapiro Library also has access to some primary sources. If you're ever in doubt, you don't know if something actually is a primary source or a secondary source, please feel free to email me. Now, you've got 4 primary sources that you have to have in your bibliography. You have 4 sources that have to be secondary sources. One of those secondary sources, at least one, has to be a scholarly book written by a historian, somebody who's an expert in the field. So keeping up with our John Muir theme, I'm using Donald Worster's book, A Passion for Nature, The Life of John Muir, as an example of a scholarly book. This is a book written by somebody who's an expert in the field, and it's a scholarly book because the historian goes through different primary sources, secondary sources, in order to really provide some sort of argument and assessment of an event in the past. That's what makes it scholarly. So like going back to talking about Frederick Douglass's A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, that is a wonderful book. It's a good first-hand account. It's a good primary source. We wouldn't count it, though, for the scholarly book because it really is just his discussing what happened to him. It doesn't rely on all the different type of scholarship at the time, the primary sources and secondary sources that are available. So therefore, it wouldn't qualify for that. Another thing, too, about the scholarly book, you want to make sure that you have a book that is focused on a topic. Books like our textbook are very valuable sources, and obviously you can find some good essays and some primary sources inside of them. However, it's a compilation book. It does not have one specific focus where research is used to back it up. So you will need to find a scholarly book in the area in which you're researching. One thing I really want to convey to everyone is that if you turn in, for example, a scholarly book review, and instead of reviewing a book, you have reviewed an article from the Shapiro Library. That's not something I'm going to be able to really give you credit for because it doesn't meet the requirement at all. If you're doing your primary source analysis and you review, let's say, a scholarly article from the Shapiro Library that's not a primary source, I'm not going to be able to give you credit for it because the whole point is that you should be able to examine a primary source and really put it in the context of the time period when it was written. And so if ever you need help, please know you can reach out to me. If you start putting your bibliography together and you're reviewing resources and you think you've got 4 really good secondary sources, but you're having a problem finding a good scholarly book, please feel free to reach out to me. And I would prefer that you do it the sooner the better because you're going to need to be able to start reading the book in time to complete your book review during week 5. So if you have any questions whatsoever about any of the milestones or the argumentative essay, please feel free to reach out to me. Also, if you're having a hard time choosing a topic or finding a topic that you can kind of narrow down, again, I'm here to help in any possible way.